There is a common perception that building wealth from zero is simply a matter of consistency, discipline, and time, that if someone earns, saves, and invests steadily, the outcome will eventually compound into something significant. And while this is directionally true, it overlooks a deeper mathematical structure that makes starting from zero fundamentally different from building on an existing base. Because when there is no initial capital, the system behaves differently. In the early phase, progress is not driven by compounding, but by contribution. Every increase in net worth comes almost entirely from active input, from income being converted into savings, and the growth from investments remains relatively small, almost negligible compared to what is being added manually. This creates a period where effort feels high relative to visible results, not because the system is broken, but because the mathematical conditions required for compounding have not yet been met. Compounding, by its nature, requires scale. A return on a small base produces a small result, and even if the percentage is consistent, the absolute impact remains limited. For example, a 10% return on $1,000 produces $100, which is meaningful but not transformative, and when this dynamic repeats over time, the system grows, but slowly, almost imperceptibly in the beginning. This is the phase where most individuals either disengage or continue, not because of immediate rewards, but because they understand that the structure is being built, even if the visible output is minimal. As the base begins to grow, something subtle starts to shift. The contributions still matter, but they begin to share influence with returns. At a certain point, the system reaches a threshold where investment growth starts to contribute a noticeable portion of the increase in net worth, and while this threshold is not fixed, it represents a transition from linear growth to something that begins to curve. This is often misunderstood as a sudden acceleration, but in reality, it is the natural result of scale interacting with consistent returns. The math does not change. The base does. And when the base becomes large enough, the same percentage begins to produce outcomes that are more visible, more impactful, and more self-sustaining. But even at this stage, the system is not purely autonomous. There is still a dependence on continued input, and there are still external variables that influence outcomes, such as market conditions, income stability, and behavioral consistency. What changes is the proportion. Growth becomes less dependent on new contributions and more influenced by the existing structure. And this shift has both mathematical and psychological implications. Because when growth begins to come from the system itself, rather than solely from effort, the perception of progress changes. There is a sense that the system is now working in the background, that time itself has become a contributing factor, and while this is accurate, it can also introduce new complexities, particularly in how decisions are made. There is also an important consideration regarding time distribution. When starting from zero, early contributions carry disproportionate weight, not because they are larger, but because they have more time to compound. A dollar invested earlier has more opportunities to grow than a dollar invested later, and this creates a structure where the timing of contributions can influence outcomes as much as the size of those contributions. This is why delays in the early phase can have long-term effects that are not immediately visible, because the system is sensitive to time in a nonlinear way. Another layer to consider is the role of setbacks. In a system that starts from zero, early losses or interruptions can have a larger relative impact because they affect a smaller base. A decline of 10% on a small portfolio reduces the total by a smaller absolute amount, but it can represent a significant portion of progress, especially when the system has not yet reached the point where growth can offset those losses. This makes the early phase more fragile, not in absolute terms, but in relative terms. As the system continues to evolve, the relationship between effort and outcome becomes less direct. In the beginning, more effort leads to more contribution, which leads to more growth. But later, growth becomes influenced by factors that are not directly controlled, such as market returns, economic cycles, and the performance of underlying assets. This introduces a level of uncertainty that requires a different kind of thinking, one that is less about maximizing input and more about managing the system as a whole. There is also a structural asymmetry in how gains and losses behave over time. A system that grows through compounding benefits from positive returns building on previous gains, but it is also sensitive to negative returns because losses reduce the base from which future growth occurs. This means that protecting the system becomes just as important as growing it, especially as the base increases. From a broader perspective, what becomes clear is that building wealth from zero is not just a slower version of building wealth with existing capital. It is a fundamentally different process in its early stages, one that relies more heavily on behavior, consistency, and time alignment, because the mathematical advantages of compounding have not yet fully emerged. And when those advantages do begin to appear, they do so gradually, not as a sudden change, but as a shift in proportions, where the system starts to carry more of the weight. Ultimately, the path from zero to significant wealth is shaped by this transition, from contribution-driven growth to compounding-driven growth, and understanding where one is within that transition can influence how decisions are made, how expectations are set, and how the system is managed over time. Because in financial systems, the math is consistent, but the experience of that math changes depending on scale, timing, and the structure that has been built. And when this framework is extended further, another layer becomes visible, which is how psychological perception begins to diverge from mathematical reality as the system grows. Because the human mind does not naturally process compounding in a linear way, even though it is often experienced through linear inputs like monthly income, savings, and contributions. In the early phase, effort and outcome feel tightly connected. Every additional hour worked, every extra dollar saved, produces a visible change in the total, and this reinforces a direct cause-and-effect perception of wealth building. But as the system begins to scale, that relationship gradually becomes less intuitive because a growing portion of the change is no longer coming from active input, but from accumulated structure. This creates a subtle disconnect between what is being done and what is being observed. And this is where many individuals misinterpret the system, not because the math is unclear, but because the feedback loop changes its shape. There is also a transition in how risk is perceived. When starting from zero, risk is often associated with volatility in income or unexpected expenses because the system is highly dependent on consistent contributions. But as the base grows, risk shifts toward market exposure, asset concentration, and timing, meaning that the nature of uncertainty evolves alongside the system itself. This means that the skills required to manage early-stage wealth are not identical to those required to manage later-stage wealth, even though they are part of the same trajectory. Another important layer is the concept of relative progress. When someone begins with no capital, the first increments of growth can feel significant in percentage terms, even if the absolute amounts are small. Going from 0 to 10,000 represents an infinite percentage increase in practical terms, and this creates a sense of momentum that is structurally different from later stages, where larger absolute gains may correspond to smaller percentage changes. This shift can influence motivation because the feedback from percentage growth becomes less emotionally salient as scale increases, even if the actual financial progress is accelerating. There is also a compounding effect in opportunity selection. In the early phase, opportunities are often constrained by capital limitations, meaning that choices are shaped by availability rather than optimization. But as capital grows, the system begins to access different categories of opportunities, including those that are not available at smaller scales. This creates a branching structure where wealth does not only grow numerically, but also expands the range of possible financial strategies that can be applied. And importantly, this expansion is not linear. It occurs in stages where certain thresholds unlock new layers of flexibility. Another subtle dynamic involves the interaction between income and investment returns over time. Initially, income is the dominant driver of growth because investment returns are too small to meaningfully impact the system. But as the base increases, investment returns begin to compete with and eventually exceed annual contributions in some cases. This is a critical structural transition because it changes the role of active work within the system. At that point, income is no longer the sole engine of growth, but one of multiple inputs feeding a larger structure. There is also a behavioral adaptation that occurs as the system matures. In early stages, financial decisions tend to be reactive, focused on immediate constraints such as bills, savings targets, and short-term goals. But as the system stabilizes, decision-making becomes more strategic, with greater emphasis on allocation, diversification, and long-term positioning. This shift is not automatic, but it often emerges as a response to increased complexity within the system. And with that complexity comes a different type of discipline, one that is less about accumulation and more about maintenance and adjustment. Another important consideration is how external perception changes. When wealth is small, it is often invisible. But as it grows, it becomes more structurally relevant in social and economic interactions, which can introduce additional pressures that are not purely financial. These pressures can influence behavior, risk tolerance, and even decision-making frameworks, adding another layer to the system that is not present at lower scales. From a systems perspective, what is happening is a gradual transition from a labor-driven model to a capital-assisted model. In the beginning, time and effort are the primary inputs. But over time, capital itself becomes an active participant in generating outcomes, which changes the underlying architecture of growth. This does not eliminate the role of effort, but it redistributes its influence across a broader set of mechanisms. And when viewed in this way, the journey from zero to a first significant wealth threshold is not simply about accumulation, but about transitioning between different types of financial systems operating under different rules of influence. Because at small scales, effort dominates. At medium scales, effort and capital interact. And at larger scales, capital begins to carry a greater portion of the system's momentum. Ultimately, the significance of starting from zero is not just the difficulty of the initial accumulation, but the structural transformation that must occur for the system to change states. And understanding that transition provides a clearer view of why progress often feels uneven, why certain phases feel slower than expected, and why acceleration only becomes visible after specific thresholds are crossed. Because in financial systems shaped by compounding, time does not simply pass through the system. It actively reshapes the system itself, gradually converting effort into structure and structure into momentum. And when this idea is extended a final step further, what becomes even more important is how irreversible certain advantages become once the system crosses those early structural thresholds, because compounding does not only accelerate growth. It also begins to stabilize it in a way that changes how fragile the system is to disruption. In the early stage, any interruption in income, any unexpected expense, or any period of inactivity has a relatively large effect on the trajectory because the system has not yet built enough accumulated structure to absorb shocks. But as the base expands, the same disturbances begin to have a reduced proportional impact, not because risks disappear, but because the system has more layers of accumulation underneath it. This creates a gradual shift from fragility to resilience, where fluctuations still exist, but they no longer define the overall direction. There is also a compounding effect in decision quality over time. Early financial decisions often carry higher relative importance because each allocation represents a larger percentage of total resources. As the system grows, individual decisions become less individually decisive, but more structurally influential because they operate on a larger base. This changes the nature of optimization, shifting it from survival-level precision to system-level efficiency. Another subtle dynamic is how time itself becomes a more visible asset. In the early phase, time feels like a constraint because growth depends heavily on active contribution. But in later phases, time begins to function as an amplifier, where holding a position long enough allows the underlying structure to express its full potential. This shift is often where the concept of patience becomes economically meaningful, not as a passive state, but as an active component of the system's design. There is also a psychological recalibration that occurs when the system reaches stability. In earlier stages, progress is often measured in short intervals, monthly or yearly changes that feel significant relative to the base. But in later stages, measurement shifts toward longer cycles because short-term fluctuations become less representative of the system's true direction. This change in perspective can alter how success is interpreted because the reference frame expands along with the system itself. And within that expanded frame, what once felt like large gains or losses begins to feel more like variation within a broader trend. At the same time, new forms of constraint begin to emerge that are not present in the early phase. As capital grows, complexity increases, requiring more structured decision-making around allocation, taxation, diversification, and risk exposure. This introduces a different kind of challenge, where the limitation is no longer lack of resources, but the coordination of resources across multiple dimensions. And this coordination becomes increasingly important as scale increases, because inefficiencies at larger levels carry greater absolute impact. From a structural perspective, what is ultimately happening is a continuous transformation of the system's operating logic. At zero, the system is purely input-driven. At early accumulation, it is input-dominant with emerging compounding. At mid-scale, it becomes hybrid, where compounding and input contribute meaningfully. And at higher scale, it becomes structure-driven, where capital and time interact as primary engines of movement. Each phase contains the previous one, but reweights its influence. And this is why the experience of wealth building often feels nonlinear, even though the underlying math remains consistent. Because what is changing is not the equation itself, but the dominance of different variables within it. Ultimately, the journey from zero to substantial wealth is less about a single transition and more about a sequence of structural reconfigurations, where each stage changes how the system behaves, how decisions matter, and how time contributes. And when viewed through that lens, progress is not just accumulation of money, but a gradual reshaping of how money operates within a system that becomes increasingly self-sustaining over time.